Zoe Crawford's laughter echoed across the playground. The 6-year-old sat cross-legged on the ground, giggling as a stranger in worn jeans and gentle hands showed her how to draw circles in the sand. "Like this, sweetie. Do you see how the circles connect?" Isabel's voice was soft, patient, as if she had all the time in the world for one lost little girl. 200 yards away, Harrison Crawford suddenly froze. His designer shoes skidded to a halt on the pristine pathway as he stared at an unbelievable sight. His daughter, the child who flinched at every touch, who screamed at every unfamiliar face, was leaning into this stranger's presence like a flower, turning toward sunlight. Who was this woman? And how could she accomplish in 5 minutes what an entire team of specialists couldn't achieve despite all his costly efforts? Harrison's chest tightened. His little daughter was smiling at someone else, and he didn't know whether he should feel grateful or afraid. The morning had started like any other disaster waiting to happen. Harrison Crawford stood in his penthouse office 30 floors above Manhattan, staring at his phone screen with the kind of dread usually reserved for tax audits or board meetings with hostile shareholders. The text from his assistant was simple enough. "Nanny quit. Effective immediately. Zoe is with building security until you arrive." But simple didn't mean easy, not when it came to his daughter. This was the 7th nanny in 8 months. Each one had come with glowing references, degrees in child psychology, and promises that they understood special needs children. Each one had left within weeks, citing everything from Zoe's challenging behavior to their own career opportunities elsewhere. The truth was simpler and more heartbreaking. His 6-year-old daughter was brilliant, beautiful, and utterly unreachable to most of the world. Harrison loosened his tie as the elevator descended, each floor marking another level of his mounting panic. Board meetings he could handle. Hostile takeovers were just elaborate chess games. But a melting down 6-year-old with autism in the lobby of Manhattan's most prestigious office building? That was uncharted territory that no MBA had prepared him for. The elevator doors opened to reveal exactly what he'd feared. Zoe sat in the corner of the marble lobby, her small body pressed against the wall like she was trying to disappear into it. Her hands covered her ears, and her eyes were squeezed shut against the assault of fluorescent lights and echoing voices. Building security stood at a respectful distance, clearly out of their depth with a child who looked like she might shatter at any moment. "Sir, we tried to keep her calm, but she won't let anyone near her," the head of security explained, his voice carrying the particular helplessness that came with watching a child in distress. Harrison nodded, understanding completely. Even he, her own father, sometimes struggled to bridge the gap between Zoe's world and everyone else's. Harrison approached slowly, the way he'd learned to move around his daughter, no sudden motions, no loud sounds, no expectations that couldn't be met. "Hey, little star," he whispered, using the nickname that sometimes worked, sometimes didn't, but always came from a place of desperate love. "Daddy's here." Zoe's eyes opened, and for a moment Harrison saw the intelligence that blazed behind them. The quick mind that could solve puzzles meant for children twice her age, but couldn't tolerate the texture of most fabrics against her skin. She didn't speak, rarely did in public, but her hand found his, and that simple touch was enough to steady them both. The ride to the park had been Harrison's attempt at damage control. Zoe loved the outdoors, found peace in the predictable patterns of trees and grass that didn't demand social interaction or eye contact. Riverside Park was usually quiet on Tuesday mornings, filled more with joggers and dog walkers than the chaotic energy of screaming children that could send Zoe into a tailspin. But children, Harrison had learned, were like weather, unpredictable and impossible to control. A birthday party had claimed the usual playground, complete with a bounce house that sounded like a jet engine and speakers blasting music that might as well have been designed to torture sensitive hearing. Zoe had lasted exactly 3 minutes before the sensory overload became too much. That was when she'd run, not away from the playground entirely, but to its edges, where the manicured grass met wild growth and where the sounds were muffled by distance and trees. Harrison had followed at a distance, knowing from experience that chasing her would only make things worse. But watching his daughter curl into herself, watching her retreat from a world that seemed determined to overwhelm her, never got easier. He'd been searching for nearly 20 minutes when he heard it, something that stopped him cold and made him question his own ears. Laughter. Not just any laughter, but Zoe's laughter, the rare and precious sound that he heard maybe once a week if they were lucky. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in a different world entirely, Isabel Martinez was supposed to be in her advanced child psychology class at Hunter College. Instead, she was in Riverside Park, having used her lunch money for a subway token, because walking through green spaces helped clear her head before her afternoon shift at the Children's Center in Queens. The textbooks in her backpack were borrowed from the library, their margins filled with her careful notes about sensory processing disorders, autism spectrum behaviors, and therapeutic techniques she could only dream of implementing professionally. Her official major was early childhood education, practical, affordable, and likely to land her a job that could pay the bills. But her heart belonged to the specialized field of autism support, a dream that seemed as distant as the expensive graduate programs she couldn't afford. Isabel had been sitting on a bench, reviewing notes about visual processing differences, when she noticed the little girl. The child had appeared from nowhere, or maybe Isabel had just been too absorbed in her studying to notice her approach. The girl was beautiful, with dark hair that caught the morning light and eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing all at once. But it was the way she moved that caught Isabel's attention. The careful, deliberate steps, the way she avoided looking directly at anything, the subtle hand movements that looked random to most people, but spoke volumes to someone who'd spent years studying autism behaviors. The little girl was overwhelmed, seeking a quiet space, and Isabel's heart went out to her immediately. "Hey there," Isabel had said softly, not moving from her bench, not making the mistake of sudden approach that might startle an already stressed child. "This is a nice spot, isn't it?" Quiet. The little girl, Zoe, though Isabel didn't know her name yet, had stopped moving but didn't look up. That was okay. Eye contact was often difficult, sometimes painful for children on the spectrum. Isabel had learned patience from her volunteer work at the community center, where she helped with after-school programs that served kids from low-income families, including several with developmental differences. "I come here sometimes when things get too loud," Isabel continued, her voice maintaining that calm, steady tone that seemed to work magic with overwhelmed children. "The trees are good listeners, and they don't ask too many questions." That's when something remarkable happened. Zoe looked at her, not directly, but close enough to see Isabel's face, to process that this stranger wasn't demanding anything from her, wasn't trying to fix or change or hurry her along. Isabel had slowly, carefully, pulled out a small notebook from her backpack. Not the expensive textbooks with their intimidating academic language, but her personal observation journal where she recorded patterns and behaviors and small victories from her work with children. She'd started sketching in the dirt beside the bench with a stick-simple geometric patterns, circles and lines that connected and repeated. "I like patterns," she'd said, more to herself than to Zoe. "They make sense when nothing else does." And then, miracle of miracles, Zoe had approached. Not directly, but in a careful spiral that brought her closer while still maintaining her escape routes. She'd sat down across from Isabel's patterns and, without a word, had started creating her own. That was when the laughter started soft at first, then growing stronger as Zoe discovered that her patterns and Isabel's could connect, could create something beautiful together. It was the sound of a child discovering that someone understood her language, someone could see the world the way she did. Harrison heard that laughter from 200 yards away and felt his world tilt on its axis. He'd been searching frantically, fighting the familiar panic that came whenever Zoe disappeared from sight. In his mind, he was already composing apologies to park security, already calculating how long it would take to organize a proper search, already imagining the worst-case scenarios that kept him awake at night. But there she was, his unreachable daughter, sitting cross-legged on the ground with a complete stranger, laughing as if joy was the most natural thing in the world. The woman with her was young, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and clothes that had seen better days. Her jeans were faded, her sneakers were worn thin at the soles, and her backpack looked like it had survived several college semesters. She was nobody special, by most standards. Nobody Harrison would have looked at twice in his usual circles of business associates and society functions. But she was doing something that a parade of highly credentialed professionals had failed to accomplish. She was reaching his daughter. Harrison approached slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever spell was happening. As he got closer, he could see what they were doing, drawing in the dirt, creating interconnected patterns that seemed to make perfect sense to Zoe's unique way of seeing the world. "Like this, sweetie. Do you see how the circles connect?" the woman was saying, her voice carrying that particular combination of patience and genuine interest that children always recognized as authentic. Each circle touches the next one, making a chain. Zoe nodded enthusiastically, adding her own circles to the pattern. She was actually talking, using words instead of the gestures and expressions that were usually her preferred communication method in stressful situations. "The chain goes everywhere," Zoe said, her voice clear and bright in a way that made Harrison's chest tight with unexpected emotion. "It doesn't break." The woman Isabel, Harrison would learn later, looked up at that moment and saw him standing there. Her expression immediately shifted from relaxed engagement to cautious awareness, the way any sensible young woman might react to a strange man appearing while she was alone with a child. "Are you her father?" Isabel asked, her voice still gentle, but with an edge of protective concern that Harrison found himself respecting immediately. "I am," Harrison said, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "Thank you for whatever you did here. She doesn't usually—" He trailed off, not sure how to explain his daughter's complex needs to a stranger, not sure how to express his gratitude for something he didn't fully understand. Zoe looked up then, really looked at him in a way she rarely did in public spaces. "Daddy, look." The circles connect. Isabel showed me how they connect. Harrison felt something crack open in his chest. His daughter had just introduced him to someone used a name, engaged in social interaction, demonstrated the kind of normal childhood behavior that he'd stopped hoping for. And she'd done it with a woman whose name suggested she was probably a college student, someone who likely had no formal training with special needs children. "I see that little star," Harrison managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "It's beautiful." Isabel was studying him now, and Harrison was suddenly aware of how he must look. Expensive suit, Italian leather shoes, the kind of obvious wealth that tended to make people either servile or suspicious. In his world, money solved problems, opened doors, created opportunities. But it had never bought him 5 minutes of his daughter's genuine happiness. "She's incredibly bright," Isabel said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't just being polite. "The way she sees patterns, makes connections, that's a real gift." Harrison had heard variations of this before, usually followed by therapeutic recommendations and fee schedules. But Isabel wasn't looking at him when she said it. She was looking at Zoe, speaking directly to his daughter, as if her opinion was the one that mattered most. "Some people see the world in straight lines," Isabel continued, addressing Zoe but including Harrison in the conversation. "But you see it in circles and spirals and connections that most of us miss. That's pretty special." Zoe beamed, and Harrison realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Not just his daughter's rare happiness, but the way this young woman had affirmed Zoe's different way of processing the world instead of trying to correct it. In 10 minutes, she'd accomplished what months of expensive therapy sessions had failed to do. She'd made Zoe feel understood instead of broken. "I should probably get going," Isabel said, gathering up her worn backpack with careful movements that didn't disturb Zoe's continued pattern-making. "I have class this afternoon." "Wait," Harrison said, the word coming out more urgently than he'd intended. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your last name." "Martinez," Isabel said, and Harrison caught the slight hesitation, the way her expression became more guarded. In his experience, people usually gave their full names freely, often adding their professional credentials and contact information before he'd even asked. "Ms. Martinez, would you consider having coffee sometime?" Harrison asked, and immediately saw her expression shift toward polite refusal. "Not, I mean, to talk about Zoe. About what you did here. She doesn't usually respond to strangers this way." Isabel looked down at Zoe, who was still absorbed in her dirt drawings, then back at Harrison. "Are you looking for a nanny?" she asked directly, and Harrison appreciated that she didn't waste time with social niceties. "I'm looking for someone who understands my daughter," Harrison said honestly. "The rest we can figure out." There was a long pause while Isabel considered this. Harrison could see her weighing something in her mind, could almost feel the careful calculation of someone who'd learned to be cautious about too-good-to-be-true opportunities. "I'm not formally trained," she said finally. "I mean, I'm studying early childhood education, and I've done some volunteer work with kids on the spectrum, but I don't have the credentials that someone like you probably expects." "Someone like you?" Harrison heard the careful distance in those words, the assumption about his expectations and requirements. In his business world, credentials were everything: degrees from the right schools, certifications from recognized institutions, references from established professionals. But his business world had never produced anyone who could make his daughter laugh. "What I expect," Harrison said carefully, "is someone who can do what you just did. Someone who sees my daughter as a person instead of a problem to be solved." Isabel studied his face for a moment, and Harrison had the uncomfortable feeling of being evaluated by someone whose opinion he desperately wanted to earn. It was a reversal of his usual experience, where people competed for his attention and approval. "I can't start immediately," she said finally. "I have classes, and I work afternoons at a community center in Queens, and I'd want to spend time with Zoe before making any commitments. Sometimes children respond well to novelty but don't sustain that connection long term." Harrison nodded, impressed despite himself by her practical approach. Most of the nannies he'd hired had been eager to start immediately, more focused on salary negotiations than on compatibility with Zoe. "We could try a few afternoons," he suggested. "See how it goes for everyone. And if it doesn't work out, no hard feelings." Isabel added, the kind of boundary setting that suggested she'd learned to protect herself from disappointment. "Agreed," Harrison said, though privately he couldn't imagine how this could not work out. His daughter was still drawing in the dirt, humming softly to herself, displaying the kind of contentment he rarely saw from her. They exchanged contact information, and Harrison watched Isabel gather her belongings with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities. Her backpack was heavy with books, and he noticed the way she checked her phone for time, with the urgency of someone who couldn't afford to be late. "Ms. Martinez," he said as she prepared to leave. "What made you approach her?" Most people wouldn't have known how to help. Isabel paused, looking back at Zoe, who had created an elaborate network of connected circles in the dirt. "She wasn't misbehaving or having a tantrum," she said simply. "She was overwhelmed and trying to cope. There's a difference, even though most people don't see it." After she left, Harrison sat beside his daughter in the dirt, not caring what the expensive fabric of his suit would look like afterward. Zoe was still absorbed in her patterns, but she leaned against his shoulder in a rare moment of physical affection that made him want to freeze time. "Did you like Isabel?" he asked carefully, not wanting to put pressure on her response. Zoe nodded, still focused on her drawing. "She understands the circles," she said simply, and Harrison realized that his 6-year-old had just provided the most accurate assessment of therapeutic compatibility he'd ever heard. That evening, after Zoe was safely tucked into bed with her weighted blanket and white noise machine, Harrison found himself Googling everything he could about autism, sensory processing, and educational approaches. Not because he hadn't done this research before. He'd become an expert on his daughter's condition out of necessity, but because he wanted to understand what Isabel had seen that so many professionals had missed. The next few days passed in a blur of logistical arrangements. Harrison cleared his afternoon schedule, something that sent his assistant into mild panic mode, but felt oddly liberating. He'd spent 6 years trying to balance his daughter's needs with his professional responsibilities, usually feeling like he was failing at both. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. Isabel arrived the following Tuesday exactly on time, carrying the same worn backpack and wearing a different but equally faded pair of jeans. She'd brought a small bag of art supplies, nothing expensive, but materials that could create the kind of sensory experiences that seemed to appeal to Zoe. Harrison watched from the kitchen window as they settled into the backyard, Isabel giving Zoe space to choose their activity while offering gentle suggestions. Within minutes, they were collaborating on a project involving colorful chalk and the concrete patio, creating what looked like an elaborate road map of interconnected designs. "She's drawing connections again," Harrison observed when he brought them water and snacks. "It's how she processes information," Isabel explained, not looking up from their shared artwork. A lot of children on the spectrum think in networks rather than linear sequences. They see relationships and patterns that neurotypical people miss. Harrison found himself taking notes, not because he planned to verify her statements against academic sources, but because he wanted to understand his daughter's world through Isabel's eyes. For the first time in years, someone was talking about Zoe's differences as strengths rather than deficits. Over the following weeks, a routine developed that surprised Harrison with its effectiveness. Isabel would arrive after her morning classes, spend 3 hours with Zoe, then leave for her afternoon job at the community center. It should have been a temporary arrangement, a stopgap while Harrison continued searching for a more permanent solution. But Zoe was thriving. She was talking more, engaging in activities she'd previously avoided, and displaying a confidence that Harrison hadn't seen since before her autism diagnosis. More importantly, she was happy, genuinely, consistently happy in a way that all the expensive interventions had failed to achieve. Harrison found himself looking forward to those afternoon hours, not just because Zoe was content, but because he was learning things about his daughter that he'd never noticed before. Through Isabel's patient observations and gentle explanations, he was beginning to understand that Zoe's behaviors weren't problems to be corrected, but communications to be interpreted. See how she lines up her toys before playing? Isabel pointed out one afternoon. She's creating order in her environment so she can focus on creativity. It's not obsessive-compulsive behavior, it's adaptive strategy. Harrison watched his daughter arrange her art supplies in careful rows, then begin working on a painting with focused intensity. For years, he'd seen the organizing as a symptom. Now he saw it as intelligence. It was during the 4th week of their arrangement that Harrison first broached the subject that had been growing in his mind. Isabel was packing up her supplies, getting ready to rush off to her afternoon job, when he asked if they could talk. "I've been thinking," he said, choosing his words carefully, "about making this arrangement more permanent. Not just the childcare, but I'd like to support your education, help you get the credentials you mentioned." Isabel went very still, the way she did when processing unexpected information. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean paying for your graduate school, helping you get the specialized training you want. In exchange for working with Zoe long-term, but also because what you're doing here, it's important work. It should be supported." Harrison watched her face cycle through several expressions: surprise, suspicion, hope, caution. He recognized the look of someone who'd learned not to trust offers that seemed too good to be true. "Why would you do that?" she asked directly. Harrison looked toward the backyard, where Zoe was still painting, humming softly to herself in the way she only did when completely absorbed in creative work. "Because you've given me my daughter back," he said simply, "and because I'm starting to understand that she's not the only child who needs someone like you." That conversation led to others, longer talks after Zoe was asleep, where Harrison learned about Isabel's background and dreams. She'd grown up in foster care, aged out of the system at 18 with good grades but no family support. She'd worked her way through community college and into her current program through a combination of scholarships, student loans, and jobs that left little time for anything else. Her dream was to work with children on the autism spectrum, but the graduate programs in applied behavior analysis and special education were expensive and time-intensive. Most required full-time study, internships, and practicum hours that were impossible to complete while working enough to survive. "I used to think maybe I could do it part-time," she told Harrison one evening as they sat in his living room, Zoe finally asleep upstairs. Take one class per semester, chip away at the degree over 10 or 15 years. But by the time I finished, I'd be too old to make a real impact. Harrison found himself getting angry on her behalf, not at her, but at a system that made it so difficult for talented, dedicated people to pursue careers in helping others. In his world, people paid enormous amounts for graduate school as casually as they bought expensive cars. The idea that someone like Isabel was being kept from her, calling by something as mundane as tuition costs, struck him as fundamentally wrong. What if cost wasn't an issue? He asked. What if you could go to school full-time, focus entirely on your studies? Isabel laughed, but not with humor. Then I'd apply to Teachers College tomorrow and spend the next 3 years learning everything I can about helping kids like Zoe. So let's do that. The simplicity of his statement hung in the air between them. Harrison was used to solving problems with resources, but he was beginning to understand that this particular problem, the gap between Isabel's potential and her opportunities, was bigger than just one person's education. I can't let you pay for my graduate school, Isabel said finally. That's not how this works. Why not? Harrison asked, genuinely curious about the rules that seemed to govern her world but were foreign to his. Because then I'd owe you something I could never repay. Because it would change everything about our relationship with Zoe. Because... She struggled for words. Because people don't just do things like that. Harrison considered this. In his world, people absolutely did things like that, invested in promising individuals, funded education, created opportunities. But he was beginning to understand that his world and Isabel's operated by different principles. What if it wasn't charity? He suggested. What if it was investment? That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. Harrison began researching not just autism interventions, but the broader challenges faced by families dealing with developmental differences. What he learned disturbed and motivated him in equal measure. The waiting lists for qualified providers were months long. The costs were prohibitive for most families. Insurance coverage was inconsistent and often inadequate. Children from low-income families had significantly less access to early intervention services, which meant their outcomes were often worse, not because of the severity of their conditions, but because of the resources available to address them. Harrison had never thought of himself as someone who cared about social justice issues. His philanthropy had been limited to tax-advantaged donations to established charities, the kind of giving that looked good in business publications, but didn't require much personal involvement. But watching Isabel work with Zoe, seeing the transformation in his daughter, he was beginning to understand that there were thousands of children who needed what Isabel could provide, and hundreds of potential Isabels who needed support to develop their skills. That's when the idea began to take shape. Not just funding Isabel's education, but creating something bigger. A center that could train people like her, provide services to families like his, and bridge the gap between need and resources in a systematic way. Harrison presented the idea to Isabel on a Friday evening in late autumn, after she'd finished her work with Zoe, and they were sharing dinner in his kitchen. It had become a comfortable routine, these end-of-week conversations where they debriefed about Zoe's progress and planned for the following week. "I want to propose something," Harrison said, setting down his coffee cup and adopting the tone he used for important business presentations. "A partnership." Isabel raised an eyebrow, clearly recognizing the shift in his demeanor. "I want to fund a center." Harrison continued. "A place that provides autism support services to families regardless of their ability to pay, and that also trains people like you, people who have the intuition and dedication, but need formal credentials and ongoing support. He pulled out a folder he'd prepared, containing research data, financial projections, and preliminary program designs. The initial funding would come from me, but the goal would be to create a sustainable model that could be replicated in other cities. Isabel opened the folder slowly, scanning the documents with the careful attention she brought to everything related to children and education. Harrison watched her expression shift from polite interest to genuine engagement as she absorbed the scope of what he was proposing. "This is huge," she said finally. "This would serve hundreds of families." "Thousands eventually," Harrison corrected. "If we do it right, if we create effective training programs and sustainable funding models, this could be the beginning of something much bigger." Isabel continued reading, asking occasional questions that showed she understood both the potential and the complexities of what he was suggesting. Her questions were practical and thoughtful, focused on implementation details and quality control measures. "Where would you want to locate it?" she asked. "Queens," Harrison said immediately. "Close to the communities that need it most, accessible by public transportation, integrated into existing support networks." Isabel nodded approvingly. "And the training component, you're thinking of creating degree programs?" "Partnerships with existing institutions," Harrison explained. "We'd provide funding and practicum sites, they'd provide academic structure and accreditation. The goal would be to make specialized training accessible to people who can't afford traditional graduate programs." They talked for hours that night, building on Harrison's initial framework with Isabel's practical insights and deep understanding of autism spectrum needs. By the time they finished, they had the outline of something that could genuinely change lives, not just for individual children and families, but for entire communities. The formal planning took months. Harrison assembled a team of consultants, lawyers, and program development specialists, but Isabel remained his primary advisor on all matters related to actual service delivery and community needs. She knew which neighborhoods had the highest concentration of unserved families, which community organizations could serve as partners, which universities had faculty members committed to inclusive education. While they planned, Isabel continued working with Zoe, but Harrison noticed changes in their dynamic. Isabel was more confident now, more willing to share her observations and suggestions. She was thinking beyond just Zoe's needs to broader patterns and principles that could help other children. Zoe, meanwhile, continued to flourish. She was sleeping better, eating a wider variety of foods, and engaging in social interactions that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Most remarkably, she was beginning to show interest in other children, asking questions about classmates and expressing curiosity about social activities that had previously overwhelmed her. "She's ready for inclusion," Isabel told Harrison one afternoon as they watched Zoe play independently in the backyard, engaged in an elaborate, imaginative game involving her art supplies and several stuffed animals. With the right support, she could succeed in a mainstream classroom. Harrison felt a complex mix of emotions at this assessment: pride in his daughter's progress, gratitude for Isabel's guidance, and something that might have been fear about letting Zoe move beyond the protected environment they'd created together. "What kind of support would she need?" he asked. Isabel launched into a detailed explanation of inclusion strategies, sensory accommodations, and communication supports. She spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent months studying specialized texts, while simultaneously applying that knowledge in real-world settings. "You should be teaching this," Harrison said when she finished. "This should be part of our training program." Isabel smiled. The first time Harrison had seen her look genuinely excited about their center plans. "I'd love that," she said. "Combining direct service with training and research, that's how you create lasting change." The Crawford Center for Autism Excellence opened 18 months later in a renovated community center in Astoria, Queens. The opening ceremony was attended by families from across the borough, many of whom had children who would be among the center's first clients. Harrison gave a brief speech about the importance of supporting neurodiversity and creating inclusive communities. But the real star of the day was Isabel, who had completed her master's degree in applied behavior analysis and was now the center's director of clinical services. She stood before the assembled crowd, parents, children, community leaders, and potential funders with a confidence that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier. She was still wearing modest clothes, but they were newer now, professional without being pretentious. Her voice was strong as she talked about the center's mission and her vision for the families they would serve. "Every child deserves to be understood," she said, looking out at an audience that included several children on the autism spectrum, some sitting quietly with their parents, others stimming happily with favorite objects, all of them welcome and accepted in this space. "Every family deserves support that honors their child's unique strengths while addressing their challenges." Harrison watched from the side of the room, holding Zoe's hand as his daughter observed the celebration with calm interest. She was starting first grade in the fall, in an inclusion classroom with support from center staff. Her teacher had already met with Isabel to learn about Zoe's communication style and learning preferences. The center itself was everything they'd envisioned and more. The main floor housed therapy rooms, group activity spaces, and a sensory integration gym designed specifically for children with autism. The second floor contained classrooms where graduate students from partner universities completed their practicum requirements while receiving intensive mentoring from experienced clinicians. But Harrison was most proud of the third component of their program, the family support services that addressed the broader needs of families dealing with autism. Financial counseling for parents, navigating insurance systems, support groups for siblings, respite care that gave families breaks without compromising their children's therapeutic progress. "Mr. Crawford," a young woman approached him during the reception, holding the hand of a boy who looked to be about 8 years old. "I wanted to thank you for making this possible. My son Marcus has been on waiting lists for services for 2 years. Harrison shook her hand, but found himself deflecting credit toward Isabel and the clinical team. This was something he was still learning, how to be proud of what they'd accomplished without taking ownership of work he hadn't directly performed. "The real thanks goes to our staff," he said. "They're the ones who will make the difference for Marcus." Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the center had been cleaned up for Monday's first official day of programming, Harrison and Isabel sat in what would become her office, sharing takeout Chinese food and processing the day's events. "I keep expecting to wake up and find out this was all a dream," Isabel said, looking around at the space that represented everything she'd hoped to create someday. 3 years ago, I was eating ramen noodles every night and wondering if I'd ever be able to afford graduate school. Harrison smiled, remembering that first day in the park when he'd been desperate for anyone who could connect with his daughter. 3 years ago, I was convinced that Zoe would never be able to function in the regular world. Now she's excited about starting first grade. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them understanding that what they'd created together was bigger than either of them could have imagined alone. The center would serve hundreds of children each year, train dozens of new clinicians, and pioneer approaches that could be replicated across the country. "What's next?" Isabel asked, and Harrison could hear both excitement and slight trepidation in her voice. Harrison pulled out his phone and showed her the messages that had been accumulating all day, inquiries from other cities, requests for consultation from existing programs, invitations to speak at national conferences. "I think," he said, "we're just getting started." 6 months later, as Harrison watched Zoe confidently navigate her first-grade classroom, participating in group activities and forming friendships with both neurotypical and neurodiverse peers, he reflected on how completely his understanding of success had changed. His business continued to thrive, but it no longer defined him. The center had become his primary focus, not because it was profitable, though it was becoming financially sustainable, but because it was meaningful in ways that corporate achievements had never been. Isabel had been invited to present at 3 national conferences that year, sharing the innovative training model they'd developed and the impressive outcomes they were achieving with children across the autism spectrum. Graduate programs were sending students from across the region to complete rotations at the center, and several universities had reached out about replicating their approach. But the real measure of their success was simpler and more profound. Children who had been written off as unreachable were learning, growing, and finding their places in the world. Families who had felt isolated and overwhelmed were discovering communities of support and understanding. And somewhere in Queens, a young woman who had once drawn patterns in the dirt with a frightened little girl was changing the world, one child at a time, proving that sometimes the most powerful intervention isn't expensive equipment or complex protocols. It's simply someone who sees potential instead of problems, connections instead of deficits, and possibilities instead of limitations. As for Zoe, she had become something her father never expected. Not just a child who had overcome challenges, but a teacher who helped others understand that different didn't mean less than, that the world was richer when it made space for all kinds of minds, and that sometimes the most beautiful patterns were the ones that looked chaotic until someone took the time to see how all the circles connected.